So there's an internet drama going on, which involves leftist trans YouTuber ContraPoints and right-wing trans YouTuber Rose of Dawn, and which Infinite Lunchbox might be wading into. If you know ContraPoints, aka the Oscar Wilde of YouTube, then you need no convincing to stick around. If you don't, then go ahead and watch Uncanceling ContraPoints first, and then come on back. So here's the basic plot of the drama. On May 10th, leftist trans YouTuber ContraPoints released a video called Cringe, which examines cringe culture on the internet. She highlights the phenomenon of morbid cringe, which is when people attack individuals online for acting in embarrassing ways, and often, unbeknownst to the attackers, in ways that remind them of something they despise about themselves. As an example of morbid cringe, ContraPoints calls out trans YouTubers who produce videos attacking other trans people they deem inadequate at performing their gender, perhaps because they remind them of their own inadequate gender performance. ContraPoints specifically calls out right-wing trans YouTuber Rose of Dawn for producing precisely this kind of morbid cringe humilitainment. A couple days after ContraPoints released Cringe, Rose of Dawn released a response video called Cope, a response to cringe, in which Rose of Dawn defends herself. She basically argues that she is not guilty of morbid cringe and doesn't produce humilitainment, and accuses ContraPoints of being somewhat of a hypocrite who's just using her theory of cringe to attack trans YouTubers she doesn't like for her own personal gain. And in the middle of all of this, Infinite Lunchbox released an episode making the case that ContraPoints embodies integral philosophy, meaning she sees the partial truth in all points of view, which does not mean that all points of view are relative. It means that all or most views have some partial truth to them, but some views have more truth than others. And the episode theorizes that integral philosophy can help ContraPoints jujitsu with her detractors. And so, let's put that theory to the test. Let's see how integral can help ContraPoints jujitsu with Rose of Dawn. You are opening the Infinite Lunchbox for a fresh take on what's going on. I'm Stephanie Lepp, and today we're going to get a fresh take on how ContraPoints can respond to Rose of Dawn using integral philosophy. To kick us off, let's take a look at some of Rose of Dawn's general criticisms of ContraPoints, starting with her introduction of coping as a frame for what ContraPoints is doing.
Contra has regularly been attacked by her own audience for airing a view that isn't quite kosher, and always issues an apology against the hate mob rallying against her. So what's the alternative if criticism is verboten? Well, she needs to cope. A cope is the action of dishonestly avoiding a debate you find yourself losing, which you know there to be valid concerns, but you want to conceal them anyway.
So Rose of Dawn claims that ContraPoints is coping in order to dishonestly avoid debates she can't win. But what makes ContraPoints so brilliant to so many people, myself included, is that, on the contrary, she very deliberately has debates she doesn't know how to win in her videos, using different characters to play each perspective in the debate. And not only does she play each perspective in the debate, she plays each perspective as a steel man or steel tran, to illustrate the strongest version of every view in order to show the partial truth in every view while showing which view has the most comprehensive truth. And she does have a character that represents the perspective of the social justice warrior, namely Tabby, so that she can engage with the social justice warrior perspective that Rose accuses her of avoiding in its strongest form, and therefore in the interest not of scoring points, but of seeking truth. In Cringe, along with calling out Rose of Dawn, ContraPoints also calls out another right-wing trans YouTuber, Blair White. And in Cope, Rose of Dawn's response to Cringe, Rose speculates that ContraPoints holds a grudge against Blair.
Since debating Blair back in 2017, Contra has had a notable dislike of Blair and her popularity, going so far as to create a thinly veiled parody of Blair known as Tiffany Tumbles.
Now, ContraPoints may dislike Blair, I don't know, but from an integral perspective, a thinly veiled parody is a misunderstanding of what's going on here. If Tiffany Tumbles does represent Blair White, that's actually a compliment to Blair White, because it means ContraPoints thinks Blair holds enough truth that she wants to include Blair as a full-fledged character in her integral debates. And not just as a full-fledged character, but as a steel-manned full-fledged character. So if Tiffany Tumbles does represent Blair White, ContraPoints perhaps should be honest about that. And yes, Tiffany Tumbles is somewhat of a caricature, as are all ContraPoints characters. And ContraPoints has Tiffany Tumbles make some excellent points. Like in her video Shame, the very relevant to cringe Tiffany's Law.
All freaks have a deep psychological need to feel superior to a different type of freak.
Going further, Rose accuses ContraPoints of having an overly broad definition of trans identity, which includes transtrenders.
Transtrenders or Jessica Yaniv aren't the reason why people may have a problem with trans people in general, but this doesn't mean there's nothing worthwhile to critique here. In the case of a transgender, they push the narrative you don't need to have gender dysphoria in order to be trans.
So ContraPoints actually has Tiffany Tumbles, supposedly aka Blair White, make precisely this point. Here we're going to see Tiffany Tumbles make this point to her leftist trans woman friend, Justine.
Are you going to try to make me read Judith Butler again? I'll summarize it. Gender is a series of gestures. It's called performativity. It's the way you dress. It's the way you speak. It's the way you act. It's the way you relate to other people. Through transitioning, we habituate to the gestures of womanhood, and socially, that makes us women, regardless of biology or psychology. Checkmate transphobes. Okay, the problem with that is that it's both too exclusionary and too inclusive. It excludes a lot of trans people who can't transition for circumstantial reasons, but whose dysphoria is very real. And it includes every transtrender, drag queen, fetishist, and 2-bit cross-dressing comedian in a Dynal wig. Well, do you really believe that a man who plays a woman on stage becomes just as much of a woman as you and me? Yes? Bitch, no you don't. Yeah, you're right. I'm full of shit.
So, although they might differ on the phenomenon of transtrenders, it seems ContraPoints actually agrees with Rose of Dawn that having too broad a definition of trans identity can be problematic, which makes Rose's following claim another misunderstanding.
ContraPoints is someone who is a textbook definition of a gender radical. For those not familiar with this phrase, it can be summed up in the 5 following points. A gender radical is someone who believes there are many genders. Biological sex is a construct. Smash the binary. Don't assume someone's gender. And all of this is accompanied by left-wing politics.
ContraPoints is a gender radical. Let's just take sex as a construct. As we just saw in Transtrenders, ContraPoints has Tiffany Tumbles, aka Blair White, critique the idea that sex is exclusively a social construct, because that would mean that transgender identity includes every transtrender, drag queen, fetishist, and 2-bit cross-dressing comedian in a wig. So I'd say ContraPoints doesn't think sex is exclusively a social construct, and therefore doesn't really qualify as a gender radical, which is part of why she gets canceled by gender radicals. Instead, I would call ContraPoints, and you can guess what I'm going to say here, a gender integralist, because she is capable of holding both that gender is social and that a purely social definition of gender may be too narrow and too broad to validate transgender identity.
Now before I end this video, I'd like to make one more point on the most condescending line from Contra's video.
Rose, are you okay?
Well, thanks for asking.
So that's where Rose of Dawn chose to end that clip from Cringe. But let's see the rest of what ContraPoints says there.
Rose, are you okay? No, you're not okay. None of us are okay. No trans woman remotely in the public eye is in any way okay. And look, I don't want to take this psychoanalysis too far, because I don't know from watching YouTube videos what's going on in someone's head.
Okay, so yes, a little condescending, but ContraPoints does acknowledge that she's completely speculating based on YouTube videos, and she also points that same mirror back at herself, admitting that she is not okay.
In my last video, I talked about how ashamed I am of being a transgender lesbian. Cringe. Shame. At the end of that video, I talk about how I sense that my shame is related to the contemptuous cringe I feel for a lot of other trans lesbians, particularly those of the heckin' stripy sock nya catgirl variety. So why do I have this cringe fixation? Well, according to the A-log theory of morbid cringing, we form obsessive and addictive contempt for people who have traits in common with us, people who make us uncomfortable because we see something of ourselves in them. So, do I have traits in common with the cowgirls? Well, we're both trans women. We're both attracted to women. I do like anime, but I don't like the anime they like, okay? I like good anime that has, mature, three-dimensional female characters. Look, I'm a real transgender, okay? I'm not like you. It's also not lost on me that this is like the 7th time on this channel I've dressed as a catgirl to make fun of them. I have posted cringe. You should all be laughing at me right now.
So ContraPoints isn't just accusing Rose and Blair of morbid cringe. She also accuses herself of having a morbid cringe obsession with trans lesbian catgirls. And she also commends Blair for publicly apologizing for her morbid cringe obsession with trans YouTuber Riley Dennis. All of this to say, ContraPoints is doing the integral work of evolving her views. Yes, the mirror she's holding up to Rose and Blair and others might be a little condescending, but she is taking a deep look into that same exact mirror and growing from what she sees. Ultimately, I think what Rose of Dawn misdiagnoses as ContraPoints being a debate-avoiding, parodying, transgender defending, overly apologizing, and hypocritical gender radical is actually just ContraPoints embodying integral philosophy. Is actually just ContraPoints incorporating more partial truths into a more holistic integration that more people can get on board with. In spiral dynamics terms, which is part of the integral canon, what Rose of Dawn sees as ContraPoints' first-tier weaknesses are actually signs of her second-tier strengths. Meaning, what Rose of Dawn sees as the weaknesses of a consciousness that thinks this view is right, all others are wrong, are actually the strengths of a consciousness that understands that most views have some partial rightness, and some views are more right than others. Okay, now that we've used integral thinking to respond to some of Rose of Dawn's criticisms of ContraPoints in general, let's use it to respond to Rose's criticisms of cringe in particular. So, what case is ContraPoints actually making in cringe? Well, she basically presents a typology of cringe. She makes the case that some types of cringe are harmless and even healthy, like self-cringe, which entails self-awareness, and not unrelated here, is often part of how people grow from their mistakes. She argues that other types of cringe, like morbid cringe, are hurtful and problematic. And she claims that Rose of Dawn, Blair White, and she herself have been guilty of morbid cringe. The case Rose of Dawn makes in Cope, a response to cringe, is that she's not guilty of morbid cringe, that she specifically critiques transgender people who illustrate the harmful implications of extreme gender radical ideology, and that ContraPoints is using her theory of cringe to attack trans YouTubers she doesn't like and to dishonestly avoid debates she thinks she'll lose. Now, I totally understand that Rose of Dawn thinks ContraPoints unfairly accuses her of morbid cringe, which again, ContraPoints accuses herself of. And I don't know enough about Rose's work, but I get the sense that ContraPoints is strawmanning her a little bit, and I'd still love to ask Rose of Dawn, what do you think about ContraPoints' theory of cringe? Do you agree there's such a thing as morbid cringe? Do you agree it's a problem? And even if you don't think you're guilty of it, as someone with a relatively large megaphone who's at least adjacent to it, is morbid cringe humilitainment a problem you're interested in helping to address? Which of course begs the question, what's your goal?
Is the primary intention here really to stop a predator? Or is it to manufacture a sleazy entertainment spectacle?
ContraPoints questions Rose and Blair's motives and goes as far as to accuse them of dressing humilitainment up as activism. Rose defends the videos of hers that ContraPoints dubs humilitainment, but doesn't really explicitly address her goals. Rose's back and forth with leftist trans YouTuber Kat Black is a great testament to her commitment to good faith transgender commentary, and the question still stands, what are Rose of Dawn's goals? Is she achieving them, and how does she know? How does she know that her video comparing early transition trans women to seals actually helped early transition trans women? ContraPoints acknowledges that she is first and foremost an entertainer, but I think she leans a little too heavily on that label, and so that same question could be posed back to her. Natalie, with all the love, what were your goals for calling out Rose and Blair in cringe? How did you think they'd respond? I imagine you had some sense they would get defensive, so did you just think there was so little room for productive dialogue that you abandoned that possibility altogether and just called them out for purposes of illustrating what morbid cringe looks like? Or did your goals as an entertainer just kind of trump everything else? If I'm right that ContraPoints, whether knowingly or unknowingly, embodies integral philosophy, then I bet there is a seed of a desire for mimetic mediation, for integrating the partial truths that Rose of Dawn holds. And in that spirit, I'm just gonna throw Infinite Lunchbox into the fray and invite ContraPoints and Rose of Dawn onto the show for an anti-debate. What is an anti-debate? Well, in a traditional debate, opponents defend their perspectives for the win. In an anti or integral debate, ContraPoints and Rose of Dawn would integrate their perspectives to find precisely the points of contact that are lost in a traditional debate. ContraPoints and Rose would each answer the question, under what circumstances, if any, is what the other person saying true? This is not both sidesism or false balance or relativism. Either ContraPoints or Rose of Dawn would be more right in a traditional debate sense, and there would be more room for more rightness. And there might actually be more agreement than they might think, given that Rose of Dawn is devoted to challenging the excesses of trans identity politics, which ContraPoints has experienced on a painful and personal level. So then, who wins an anti-debate? Well, everyone. Although some people win more than others. So, Natalie and Rose, when y'all are ready to anti-debate, you are cordially invited into the Infinite Lunchbox. Last thing.
Melissa Dahl advocates not self-love or self-hate, but what she calls self-indifference. She says, self-indifference is the relief of realizing that you are simply not that big a deal. So yeah, I was pretty cringy in the past, and I'm still pretty cringy now, but you know what? Everyone else is pretty cringy too. And the world's probably gonna burn down in 50 years anyway, so...
Well, hey,
I don't know
as
if I-
Contra said in her video, maybe.
Nothing matters. Nothing matters. Nothing matters. Nothing matters.
Nothing matters. Ladies, 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 understanding that we're not that big a deal and the world is burning doesn't necessarily need to lead to the nihilistic view that nothing matters. From an integral perspective, we can hold all of the above. which would shift the question from whether to practice self-love or self-hate or self-indifference to under what circumstances might it be helpful to practice self-love or self-cringe or self-indifference? Under what circumstances might it be helpful to hold at the forefront of our minds that the world is burning versus to just relish the present moment? And getting meta, under what circumstances might it be helpful to think that nothing matters versus everything matters versus some things matter? Because in our current circumstance, where we're all spending more time online, I would say that addressing online morbid cringe matters. And that was Integrate, a response to cope, a response to cringe, as brought to you by the Infinite Lunchbox. If you would like more ContraPoints commentary, as in responses to her videos as they come out, please let me know in the comments. And on that note, thank you for your comments. I read every single one of them, so please continue to comment on YouTube and Twitter at StephLep, along with subscribe on YouTube, give 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, share on social media, and support the Infinite Lunchbox on Patreon. Thank you.